Hey guys, this is Eckhart Slaughter. Hello and welcome to another episode of Star Wars Starship vs. the series, where I take two ships within the Star Wars universe, put them head to head, and try to predict which one would come out on top. We've got another very fun video today because once again, we are not doing a typical Star Wars ship-to-ship matchup. We're actually doing something a little crazy today. The idea for today's matchup comes from L. Dodson, who suggested that I put an Imperial 1 class Star Destroyer against the modern US military, and he says, in standard atmosphere. I'm actually just going to take a suggestion and change it very slightly by using an Imperial 2 class Star Destroyer, just because it's a much more famous ship that I think people are a lot more aware of. I considered totally altering the matchup and using an Executor Super Star Destroyer, but I thought that ship's orbital bombardment capabilities, or just its bombardment capabilities in general, were a little too powerful. So let's talk about rules for this matchup, because it is a weird one, so it is going to need some pretty strict rules. The first thing I want to talk about is win condition. So how does each faction win? Well, I think it's fair that if the Star Destroyer can survive 24 hours, then it wins. On the other hand, the US military actually has to destroy the Star Destroyer itself. Now, both sides will be bloodlusted, so they won't be interested in either peace or running away. Also, neither faction has any sort of knowledge of each other, and the Star Destroyer does not have any Sith Lords on board. Finally, and I guess this one isn't so much a rule as it is my methodology for deciding this matchup, I'm going to focus on logic, practicality, and logistics rather than sheer numbers and yields. That's just because the US military is so very large that it would be impossible to categorize every single weapon that they have available to them. I guess there are a couple of other things to note, and that's that I'm not going to do this matchup as I traditionally would with three set categories. I'm just going to talk about the warfare abilities of each ship and then look at the actual matchup. Also, I will not be using the crazy Star Wars Legends numbers, especially around turbo laser yields or shield strength. One last thing to please keep in mind is that I'm not a military expert, I'm not a military historian, I'm not in the military. So I'm going to be speaking about the US military assets from a layman's perspective, so please don't crucify me if I make some basic mistakes. Again, this episode is going to have a focus on practicality rather than specifics. Alright, so let's now talk about the military assets available to each faction. We'll start first with the US military. So if the Star Destroyer were allowed to park in orbit, the military wouldn't really have anything that they could do to harm it, at least not really effectively. However, because it is limited to atmosphere only, they will have some available firepower. And on this note, I'm going to specifically limit the Star Destroyer to a maximum of 35,000 feet, which actually isn't very high at all and is certainly far within the range of being in atmosphere. At this height, I believe that the US military will only really have two weapons that will be effective against the Empire. The first is surface-to-air missiles, and the second is aircraft, and I think that that's pretty much it. So, given this limitation, how many resources does the US military actually have? We'll start with aircraft, and the United States has more militarized air resources than any other country on Earth. Now, during my research, I've used globalfirepower.com as a source for my numbers, so if I make any mistakes, complain to them, not to me. Anyway, I think their two most useful air assets will be both fighter craft and attack aircraft. The difference between these are pretty simple. Attack aircraft are meant to actually attack targets, while fighters are meant to fight against other aircraft. In reality, the United States military relies pretty heavily on multi-role fighters, so the numbers aren't really quite so clear. Many of the fighters overlap into both categories, but for simplicity purposes, we'll say 2,300 fighters and 2,800 attack aircraft. Probably the most advanced fighter used by the US military is the F-22. It's the best anti-fighter aircraft in the world, but can also be used in an attack role. Other notable aircraft include the F-35 and the F-18. Most of these vehicles would carry both air-to-surface and air-to-air weaponry and would be quite effective in a real-life scenario. In addition, the military would have thousands of transport, logistics, and other aircraft available for their use. There are a few limits that we need to talk about here. Not all of these aircraft are stationed domestically, some are on foreign soil, some are on aircraft carriers, but many will not be available during an invasion. Also worth noting is that the United States is a very big country and it takes many hours for a jet to fly across country and would need to be refueled along the way. So not all will be available for any given battle. I'm going to ignore the foreign aircraft though and just pretend that all of the fighters are stationed within the United States. This is just to make things more interesting, and because in reality, the US also hosts many foreign aircraft on their bases. So for example, planes from the United Kingdom or from Canada or other countries would be stationed on US bases and would probably be used in the case of an extraterrestrial invasion. I won't, however, be ignoring the logistics of actually using these aircraft, and I'll talk about this more when we get to the actual matchup. Besides for aircraft, the United States will also likely make use of nuclear missiles. Some of these missiles are fired from surface, some are fired from submarines, and others are carried into battle by aircraft. In addition, the United States also has 920 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which would also likely be able to hit the Star Destroyer, and also 80 nuclear bombers carrying an unknown stockpile of weapons, but again, probably a lot more there. In total, that's a lot of firepower, especially when you look at the Air Force, the Navy, and everything else available to the US military. But let's now turn to the Empire and take a look at the weaponry of one Star Destroyer. The Imperial II class Star Destroyer is a very mean, very dangerous spaceship, and a single Star Destroyer actually constitutes a very serious risk to a planet. The standard Imperial II had 50 heavy turbo laser batteries, 50 regular turbo laser batteries, and then additional turbo lasers, ion cannons, and very powerful octuple barbette turbo laser cannons. How powerful are these weapons though? And how effective would they be at fighting a battle on Earth? Well, quite effective. The Star Destroyer is actually designed for orbital bombardment, or at least that's one of its main purposes. There are many quotes from the expanded universe that make it clear that a single Star Destroyer can actually reduce an entire planet to glass. This is often referred to as slagging a planet, or more formally by Imperial standards, a base Delta Zero. However, at least to my knowledge, we've never seen a single Star Destroyer actually perform a base Delta Zero. I mean, I'm sure that they could, but the question is how long would it take? That would kind of help us determine how much firepower a single ship has. Based on what we've seen in Star Wars Legends, and I mean, we can go back to Knights of the Old Republic and the bombing of Terrace, seems like a Star Destroyer is most likely capable of destroying a major city in perhaps an hour, maybe less than that. And I'm talking if the Star Destroyer wanted to completely wipe out all life in a major sprawling city like New York. If it wanted to just decimate the military assets at a certain location, I'm fairly sure that it could do so in minutes. However, the United States is a very, very large and diverse country, and I'm fairly certain that the Star Destroyer won't be able to destroy all of the military assets or all of the people within America in 24 hours. And that's fine because remember, it just has to survive, but I'm just saying that I don't think the firepower is that overwhelming. Other than its main guns, the Star Destroyer also has access to 72 TIE fighters, several Lambda-class shuttles which can be used to transport troops, along with other gunboats and other troop transports, and probably 10,000 stormtroopers. In addition, the Star Destroyer probably would have carried around 100 walkers and other assault vehicles. So, we now have a pretty good idea of the numbers and the strength of these two factions, but what would actually happen if an Imperial II Star Destroyer appeared in atmosphere above the United States of America? Would the US military be able to defeat the very, very large ship in under 24 hours? First thing I want to make clear is that seriously bad things are happening to the United States of America in this scenario. The Star Destroyer is very, very well armed, very well armored, and actually pretty fast. It can move at 975 kilometers per hour in atmosphere. That's not quite as fast as a jet, but still very fast. However, the problem here for the Star Destroyer is that the United States just has so many military assets. They have so many weapons, so many bases, such a good logistic capacity. And that's all made worse by the fact that the Star Destroyer doesn't actually know where these bases or these resources are, so they can't do surgical strikes or attacks to weaken the military. The Star Destroyer is likely going to want to take a defensive posture, moving very quickly and trying to use its advanced sensors to both disable the communication of the military and identify key weak points that it can attack. However, like I mentioned, the military has an abundance of resources. The very first thing that it's going to do, most likely, when it realizes how grave a threat the invading Star Destroyer is, will be to attack it with its nuclear missiles. And right away, we have probably over 400 intercontinental ballistic missiles ready to be fired, and these can most likely hit the Star Destroyer anywhere that it's placed in the continental United States, which will be where the battle is being fought. Now, surely the Star Destroyer will be able to defend against some of these missiles. I mean, it does have TIE fighters and it has turbo laser cannons. Both of these should help shoot down projectiles. However, it does not actually have anti-starfighter weaponry, it doesn't have a dedicated point defense system or flak turrets or anything of the sort. These technologies, in my mind, would be key to defending against a prolonged missile strike. Making matters worse, the Star Destroyer only has 72 TIE fighters. Now, these may or may not be superior to modern day fighters. They probably are, but they've got a severe number disadvantage. The US military should be able to mobilize hundreds of fighters within hours, and through a combined effort, I would think that these would be able to whittle down the Star Destroyer's TIE defenses. While this is going on, of course, the Star Destroyer is going to be absolutely scorching the United States, destroying major cities, destroying military bases, but again, without any real guidance. And of course, the military is going to take severe losses, but I think they will be able to establish air superiority. The next step will be to get the bombers in and to continue attacking with conventional and nuclear weapons. The question is, I guess, does the United States military have enough pure firepower to actually destroy the Star Destroyer? And I say that that's the question because I think it's clear that the Star Destroyer cannot actually do enough damage to completely disable the US military. Again, within 24 hours, it will probably be able to do some serious damage. It will probably demoralize a lot of people, but I don't think we'll actually be able to land enough critical blows to stop the military from being able to fight back. As I mentioned earlier, the United States military has access to around 500 or so Minuteman III nuclear missiles. Each Minuteman carries 3 nuclear warheads, and the missile has a total yield of about 900 kilotons to 1.5 megatons, which is quite powerful. In total, that means that the US military is able to output about 500 megatons of power, and that's if every missile hits, which probably isn't likely. Still, if only half connect, which to be honest, I think is pretty generous for the Imperials, that's 200 to 300 megatons of energy being directed at one ship. And I know right now someone's going to pop in and say, well, that's what the old Star Wars Episode 2 cross-sections book said that one turbo laser outputted. Well, to be honest, that's baloney because those numbers are way too high and don't match at all what we see on screen. Keep in mind that this yield is only for the US's intercontinental ballistic missiles, which actually make up a relatively small part of their nuclear inventory. They also have submarine-launched missiles and missiles carried by strategic bombers. The US also has backup strategic nuclear missiles, which, although not currently in use, could probably be prepped for use within 24 hours. In total, the United States has an obscene amount of nuclear weapons, and they certainly have enough to kill all life on the planet Earth probably many times over. And I just don't think that, unless we go to the really silly Star Wars Legends numbers, that there's any way a Star Destroyer can survive this amount of firepower. And I mean, if we go off what we've seen in just the movies, there's certainly no way that it can. Let's look at the Empire Strikes Back in the Battle of Hoth. A single ion cannon was able to disable an Imperial Star Destroyer. Now, I'm sure that this ion cannon was very powerful, but I don't think it compares to the total weaponry of the US military. Given the logistics advantage of the US military, their, at least in my mind, superior firepower and the ability for them to hit the Star Destroyer anywhere over the United States, and the fact that they will control the skies with a superior amount of fighters, I have to give this battle to the United States military. I just think that the weaponry advantages are too great. And I actually think it will be a complete stomp. I'm going to give this one to the US 9 times out of 10. The only chance that I'm giving the Star Destroyer is if we have to go with those kind of bogus Star Wars Legends numbers, which puts the yield of a single shot in the 300 megaton range. Again, completely ridiculous. But that's just one man's opinion. I would love to hear what you think. Let me know down in the comments if I made any mistakes, if there were some improvements that I could make to this video, or, if you think I did a really good job. Also, take a second right now to vote in the upper right corner and let me know who you think would win. Also, if you haven't already, make sure to down in the comments, leave your suggestion for next video, which matchup you'd like to see that is. And I'm going to be paying particular attention to anyone who suggests a Star Wars versus Star Wars matchup, because I kind of want to do a traditional normal video sometime this week. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you want to get further involved in the community, you can follow me on Twitter or join the Discord. There's links down in the description. Also, I still am raising money on my GoFundMe page, although I will say I have met my personal goal, so if you're on the fence about donating, don't feel the need to. You can find a link for that also down in the description. If you like this video, please like it. I worked really hard on the research for this one, so I would love to get it over 2,000 likes, although I will admit that is a pretty lofty goal. Regardless, I'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you once again for watching, and hey, may the Force be with you.